The GPS kept trying to reroute me onto the highway, and I kept ignoring it. I took the back roads instead, the ones that cut through the old tobacco fields, past the feed store with the rusted Coca-Cola sign that's been there since before I was born. I didn't need directions. My hands remembered. Millhaven, North Carolina. Population 4,200, give or take whoever had left or died since the last census. I hadn't been back in almost 4 years. I told myself I came back for my father. That was mostly true. The invitation had arrived as a text from my aunt, forwarded from a church bulletin, which was exactly the kind of communication chain that only exists in small towns. The Millhaven Veterans Fellowship was holding its annual appreciation dinner. My father, 22 years Army, retired Master Sergeant, was being recognized for his service and for the work he'd done with the county's veteran outreach program. It was a big deal by Millhaven standards. The high school gymnasium, a catered dinner from the barbecue place on Route 9. Probably a plaque. I texted back that I'd be there. 20 minutes later, my stepmother called. She didn't lead with hello. She never does. "Your father says you're coming," she said. The tone wasn't warm. It was the tone of someone confirming an appointment they didn't book and didn't want. "I am," I said. "He mentioned you might wear your uniform." A pause. I told him that would be a bit much. It's his night, not yours. I looked out my apartment window at the parking garage across the street. I counted to 4. "I'll see you Saturday," I said. She said something else. I said, I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a while with the phone face down on the counter. My stepmother, her name is Linda, came into my father's life when I was 15. She is the kind of woman who fills rooms with opinions and calls it personality. She had never been openly cruel to me, not exactly. What she'd done was quieter than that. She'd spent 11 years making sure I understood, in small, consistent ways, that I was a guest in my father's new life, that my accomplishments were footnotes, that my presence was tolerated. When I enlisted at 22, she told my father it was a shame. Not that she didn't support the military, she was quick to add that every time, but that someone with my potential was settling. She said this in front of me at Thanksgiving, with the kind of smile that makes cruelty look like concern. When I made lieutenant commander at 30, she said she wasn't sure what that meant, but that she was sure I was very proud. She wasn't being modest. She genuinely didn't know, or didn't want to know, what it meant. I drove into Millhaven on a Saturday afternoon in late October. The town looked the same. It always looks the same. The Presbyterian church on Main Street. The diner with the pie cases in the window. The stoplight that swings on a wire instead of hanging from a proper arm. I'd spent 18 years inside this town, and I still felt like I was visiting someone else's memory whenever I came back. My father lived in the same house I grew up in, a 2-story colonial with green shutters that had faded to something closer to gray. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a moment. Force of habit. In a lot of situations I've been in, you take 30 seconds before you go in. He was on the porch before I got to the door. My father is not a man who shows things easily. He was Army for more than 2 decades, and it did what it does. It gave him a posture and a quiet and a way of looking at the middle distance that means he's thinking 3 things and saying none of them. But he came down the porch steps when I got out of the car, and he put both arms around me, and that said everything he wasn't going to say out loud. "You look good," he said. "So do you, Dad." He did, mostly. A little grayer, a little more deliberate in how he moved. He'd had a knee replacement the year before and was still protective of it. Linda appeared in the doorway. She had her hair done for the occasion, and she was wearing a blazer over a floral blouse. She smiled at me the way you smile at someone in a work meeting you don't know well. "Teresa," she said. "Good drive, fine, thanks. You can put your things in the guest room. We're leaving at 6. That was the conversation. I carried my bag upstairs and changed and came back down, and we sat in the living room and made polite noises for 2 hours. Linda talked about a neighbor's renovation project and the church's Thanksgiving food drive. My father asked about my work, carefully, the way he always asked, because he wasn't always sure what he was allowed to know and what he wasn't. I told him what I could. He nodded. Linda at one point asked if I was still doing the Navy thing. I was 31 years old. I had been in the United States Navy for 9 years. I had been selected for commander 6 months earlier, a promotion that placed me in roughly the top 3% of officers at my career stage. I was attached to the Defense Intelligence Agency on a work arrangement that I was not going to explain over a plate of crackers and brie in my father's living room. "Still doing it?" I said. She nodded like I'd said I was still taking a pottery class. The gymnasium at Millhaven High had been transformed the way small towns transform gymnasiums. Folding tables with tablecloths, centerpieces made of small American flags and flower arrangements, a podium at one end with a microphone that was already feeding back slightly when we walked in. The bleachers had been pushed back. Someone had put up a banner that read, "Hon Ring, Lost Wage," in red, white, and blue. It was full. I hadn't expected that. Maybe 200 people. Veterans, families, county officials, people from the VFW post, 2 towns over. My father was greeted immediately, people moving toward him with handshakes and claps on the shoulder. He straightened when they did. He belonged here in a way I'd never seen him belong anywhere. I stayed near the edge of the room. I was not in uniform. I'd considered it and decided against it, partly because of what Linda had said and partly because this was genuinely my father's evening and I had no interest in making it about me. I was wearing a dark blazer and slacks. Conservative. Invisible, more or less. I found our table and sat down. My father's sister Margaret was already there with her husband and a few of my father's friends from the VFW. I knew most of them from when I was a kid. They asked about my work the way people in Millhaven always did, with a kind of polite incuriosity, waiting for me to stop talking so they could tell me about their grandchildren. Linda sat beside my father across the table. Every so often she said something to him in a low voice and he nodded. She was pleasant enough through the salad. Then the table next to us, a group of older veterans, several still in parts of their dress uniforms, started asking my father about his service, and he started talking, and Linda leaned over to say something to Margaret, and I heard her say it because she was not being particularly quiet. Teresa's always had to be the center of attention. She joined up to prove a point, I think. Never really made it far. Margaret looked at her, then looked at me. I picked up my water glass. I took a sip. Margaret said carefully, "She's done very well, actually." "Oh, I'm sure," Linda said. She said it the way you'd say, "if you say so." Then she turned back to my father. I looked at my plate. The chicken was dry. I ate it anyway. It got worse after the program started. The master of ceremonies, a retired colonel named Douglas Hatch, who had the bearing of someone who had given exactly this kind of speech 100 times, worked through a list of honorees before getting to my father. Each one was called to the podium. Each one got a handshake and a plaque and a round of applause. When my father's name was called, the room gave him a standing ovation that started before he even got to the front, because that's the kind of man he is, the kind who inspires things from a distance. He gave a short speech, talked about the men in his unit, about what service meant, about the county veterans outreach, which he'd helped found, which had connected 67 veterans with housing assistance and employment resources in the past 3 years alone. He was not emotional exactly, but there was a particular quality to his voice that made the room go very still. I clapped until my hands hurt. When he came back to the table, Linda leaned over and kissed his cheek and whispered something, and he put his hand over hers. I looked away. After the formal program, things loosened up. People moved between tables. The DJ started playing soft background music, mostly country, some older rock. A few people came to speak to my father and I stepped back to give them room, drifting toward the edge of the room again. That's when Linda found her moment. She was talking to 2 women from the church. I recognized them distantly, the kind of faces you know without knowing names. And I was close enough to hear because the gym's acoustics were not forgiving. "Her father is so proud," one of the women said. "Both of you in the military." "Oh, I was never," Linda started. "No, I meant his daughter, Teresa. She's in the Navy, isn't she?" Linda smiled. It was the smile I knew. She was. She's been reassigned. Something administrative, I think. In DC or somewhere. She doesn't really talk about it. You know how it is? Sometimes people say they work in certain capacities and then you find out later it's... She trailed off and lifted one shoulder. "It's just not what it sounds like." The woman looked uncertain. "She seems very accomplished. She's had opportunities," Linda said. "Whether she's made the most of them, I really couldn't say." I walked away before she could see that I had heard. I went to the far side of the gym and stood by the windows that overlooked the parking lot. The glass was cold. I put my hand flat against it for a moment. Outside, the streetlights made orange pools on the asphalt. I was not going to cry. I was not going to walk back in there and say anything. I was not going to make a scene at my father's dinner. I had been trained, literally and otherwise, to manage worse situations than this without losing composure. I knew that. I just needed a minute. I took the minute. Then I went back inside. I was getting coffee from the side table near the podium when I heard my name. Not the name I grew up with. Not Teresa Aldrich, the girl from Millhaven who took the back roads out of town at 18 and never found a good reason to take them back. The name I had earned. Commander Aldrich. I turned around. The man who had said it was in his early 60s, dressed in civilian clothes but carrying himself in a way that made clothes irrelevant. I recognized him immediately. Rear Admiral James Whitfield, currently assigned to the Office of Naval Intelligence. We had worked adjacent to each other on a joint task force 18 months earlier. He was not a man you forgot. He was not a man who forgot you either, apparently. He was smiling, surprised. "What are you doing here?" "My father is Walter Raymond Aldrich," I said. "He was honored tonight." "Raymond Aldrich, Sergeant First Class." He nodded slowly, putting it together. "I didn't know that was your father." He extended his hand. "Small world." I shook it. "It is, sir." "I'm here with the State Veterans Commission," he said. "Friend of mine on the organizing committee. I snuck out of a dinner in Raleigh." He smiled. "Don't tell anyone." He asked how things were at the DIA. I told him they were moving. He asked about a specific project, not by name, just by implication, and I gave him a brief and appropriately vague answer, and he nodded the way people nod when they know what the vague answer means. We talked for maybe 5 minutes, there by the coffee urns, while the gym hummed around us. I did not notice that the room had gone quieter. I did not notice that people had begun to turn toward us, subtly, the way rooms shift when something has changed at the center of gravity. What I did notice was the moment that Rear Admiral Whitfield straightened slightly and said, at a volume that was not quite a projection but that carried, the way a man accustomed to being heard in large rooms always carries. "Well, it's good to see you out of uniform. You've earned a night off." And then, because he was the kind of man who had been saluting his entire adult life, and the reflex was bone deep and genuine, he gave me one. A salute. Clean? Correct. Held for a full beat. In the United States military, officers do not salute their subordinates indoors except under specific protocols. But flag officers, admirals, generals, sometimes render the salute as a gesture of profound respect. It is not common. When it happens, people notice. The people at the table nearest us noticed. The 2 women from the church, who had been walking past, noticed. My father, who had just turned from a conversation 15 feet away, noticed. Linda noticed. I returned the salute. Automatic, correct. Then I shook his hand again, and he said, "Give my regards to your team," and moved on to greet someone else. I stood where I was. The woman from the church, the one who had called me accomplished and been gently corrected by Linda, was looking at me with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of someone quietly revising a calculation. My father was looking at me too. He had gone very still. Linda was looking at her phone. My Aunt Margaret appeared at my elbow about 2 minutes later. "Was that who I think it was?" she asked. "Depends on who you think it was," I said. "Teresa. An admiral I've worked with," I said. "We crossed paths on a project." She looked at me for a long moment. "She is my father's sister, which means she has his eyes and his habit of saying more in silences than in words." "Why didn't you tell him?" she asked, not accusatory. Genuinely wondering. "Tell him what? About your work? Your promotion? Any of it?" I thought about that. It wasn't that I was keeping secrets, not from my family. My father knew I'd been promoted to commander. He'd called me on the day I told him, and he hadn't said much, but I'd heard it in his breathing, the way you can tell someone is proud even when they don't have the words. It was more that I had learned, over years, that trying to explain what I did to Linda was like trying to describe color to someone who'd decided they weren't interested in seeing. I'd stopped offering information she didn't want. "He knows," I said. Margaret nodded. "Then, Linda doesn't." No, I said, she doesn't. My father came over a few minutes later. He didn't say anything about the Admiral. He put his hand on my shoulder, the way he used to when I was 12 and had done something he was proud of and didn't know how to say so. Just the weight of it. Thank you for coming, he said. Of course, Dad, I know it wasn't easy. He meant the drive. He meant the room. He meant everything else, the way he always did when he said the thing that was on the surface. It means a lot, you being here. I covered his hand with mine for a second. Wouldn't have missed it, I said. The drive back to my hotel was 12 minutes. I took the long way. Linda's voice had followed me out of that gym. She doesn't really talk about it. Sometimes people say they work in certain capacities, and I let it play once, because it's better to look at the thing than to pretend it isn't there. Then I let it go. Not because it didn't hurt, because it did, but because I had learned the difference between things that cost you and things that are simply the price. Linda would spend the rest of that night trying to figure out what she'd missed. She would ask my father questions he wouldn't fully answer, because he would be thinking about his daughter standing in a high school gymnasium shaking hands with a Rear Admiral, while his wife whispered across a table that his daughter had never really made the most of her opportunities. He called me the next morning, early, before I'd checked out of the hotel. I'm proud of you, he said. Just that. No preamble. Thanks, Dad. I should have said it more. I looked out the hotel window, the parking lot, the gas station across the road, the tobacco fields beyond that, flat and gray in the morning. You said it the way you knew how, I said. I always knew. He was quiet for a moment. Are you going to come back again soon? Yeah, I said. I will. Good. Another pause. Linda might have some questions. About your work? She can ask, I said carefully. Will you answer them? I thought about it honestly. Some of them, I said. The ones I can. He laughed, a small sound, more air than voice. Fair enough. I checked out at 9 and stopped at the diner on Main Street for coffee and a piece of pie, because it was early enough that they still had cherry. I sat at the counter and ate it slowly and watched Millhaven wake up through the window. A man in a work jacket walking a dog, a woman unlocking the florist shop across the street, a pickup truck idling at the swinging stoplight. I had grown up inside this view and driven away from it and built something out of the driving away. Not a better life than the one I left, not worse. Just different. Mine. The pie was good. The coffee was too strong and I drank all of it. When I got in the car, the radio found the oldies station again, like it always does in Millhaven. Some song I half knew from a summer I don't fully remember. I let it play all the way to the highway. I'd spent a long time thinking that someday Linda would understand what I'd made of myself, and that understanding would arrive like a door opening, like something correcting itself. That I would be visible, finally, in the way I'd wanted to be visible. Sitting in that gymnasium while a Rear Admiral saluted me and the room went quiet, I realized that the moment I'd imagined had come and gone, and it had felt like almost nothing, not because it wasn't real. Because I no longer needed it to be. That was the thing I couldn't have explained at 22, or 25, or even 28. The approval you spent years waiting for stops being the point somewhere along the way. If you're building the right things in the meantime, you don't stop wanting it, not entirely, but it stops being what your work is for. My work was not for Linda. It was never for Linda. The highway opened up ahead of me, wide and gray and going north. I set the cruise control and drove. I've thought a lot about that night since it happened, not the salute, though I won't pretend that didn't land somewhere deep. What I keep coming back to is the quiet on the drive home. 12 minutes to the hotel. I took the long way. Here's what I've figured out, or at least what I think I've figured out. The way Linda treated me for 11 years wasn't really about me. It was about what she needed to believe. She needed to believe that my accomplishments were smaller than they looked, that my silence was confusion rather than discipline, that my absence from family dinners was avoidance rather than deployment. Because if none of that was true, then she had spent a decade being unkind to someone who hadn't earned it. And that's a harder thing to live with than being right. I don't say that to excuse it. What she did, whispering to those women that she never really made the most of her opportunities, delivered with that particular smile. That was a choice. People make choices. The choices compound over time into something that looks a lot like character, and that's the part I keep returning to, because it applies to me just as much as it applies to her. I made choices too. Every year I stayed quiet instead of correcting her. Every Thanksgiving I let the comment pass. Every phone call where I gave her the minimum because it was easier than the alternative. I told myself it was discipline, that I was being the bigger person. Maybe sometimes that was true, but some of it was also fear, not of Linda exactly, but of what it would cost to be fully known in that house and still not be accepted. What I've learned, slowly and not without cost, is that you cannot outsource your self-worth to the people who withheld it. You can wait your whole life for Linda to understand what you've built, and she may never understand it, not because the evidence isn't there, but because understanding it would require her to revise something she's decided about herself. That revision is her work to do, not mine to perform. My father called me the next morning and said he was proud of me. He said he should have said it more. I told him he said it the way he knew how, and that I always knew. That was true. It was also the most honest conversation we'd had in years, and it happened because a Rear Admiral shook my hand in a high school gymnasium in Millhaven, North Carolina, and the room went quiet in a way that made the silence Linda had been counting on impossible to maintain. That's what I mean when I talk about cause and effect without dressing it up in anything mystical. The work you do in private eventually becomes visible. Not always. Not on your timeline. But the things you build with real effort and real integrity have a way of showing up in the room whether you announce them or not. You don't have to perform your worth. You just have to keep doing the work. The hardest part isn't earning the thing. It's deciding, somewhere along the way, that you are worth the effort of earning it before anyone else agreed. I decided that a long time ago. In a lot of ways, Millhaven is why.